Hello, gentlemen, and welcome to another Palaview market research video. Today, I'm going to be describing economic and psychological warfare in the modern world. This is something I have somewhat of an expertise in. This is what I studied in college. And at the end of this video, you're going to have a much better sense for why our world feels so confusing to understand. And the economic policies and the philosophies that underpin economic and psychological warfare in our modern time. Now, if you haven't noticed, the news or how the government decides to share information with you is designed to make you feel hopeless, depressed, but most of all, confused. That defeatist response that you and inevitably everyone else you probably know experiences is a key feature of this new system of political and economic control. And who has maintained this power in our modern world the best? Well, that's who we have to study, right? Who has maintained power the best since, say, late 80s? It's Vladimir Putin. Now, how did Vladimir Putin maintain this power? Well, he has these advisors. And this very important advisor, Vladislav Surkov, is an extremely important person that you probably have never heard of. He comes from the theater and the art world. And what he essentially did was he essentially brought ideas from the modern art world and brought them into the heart of politics, economic warfare, and war, period. Now, in order to understand this, we have to understand avant garde art, right? And its massive success in the 1990s, which proved that with enough resources and enough philosophy and academia and perception, if you will, you could effectively undermine and redefine what was considered beautiful. Like you see in this French Revolution image compared to an example of an avant garde piece right next to it, we were able to successfully undermine the average individual's perception of the art world. And so he realized that if this could be done in the world of art, it could happen through politics and economics. Because ultimately, if you want to control a populace, you want to leave them in a constant state of confusion. And I'm going to describe how and why. Now, how did they do this practically? So, Surkov in Russia began sponsoring and providing funding to contradictory groups: climate change activists, human rights advocates, LGBTQ, neo Nazi skinheads, and even anti Putin parties all received funding and support from, you know, these different government agencies in Russia, which essentially successfully simulated and stimulated democratic participation in the country, the participation in democracy. But where this gets weird is that Surkov then revealed that this is what he was doing, which ultimately made the problem worse because it meant that no one was real or fake. And it meant that no one really knew if Surkov was telling the truth about whether or not this is what they were doing. One Russian journalist described this as a strategy of power that keeps any opposition constantly confused, a ceaseless shape-shifting that is unstoppable because it is undefinable. Then it gets even more interesting. Surkov published this book, and in it he described this phenomenon called nonlinear warfare. And that is essentially a war where you really never know what's going on and who the enemy is and what they're up to and what their goals are. The underlying aim, according to Surkov, of a nonlinear war is not to win the war, but to use the conflict to create a constant state of destabilized perception in order to manage and control. And the key word here is manage, as their goal is to maintain the status quo. It's to maintain Putin's position of power by doing what? By simulating and stimulating change, movement, different problems occurring, different groups gaining power and influence in the country. It's a simulation of and stimulation of these important human needs, right? The need to be heard. Now, but what's really important to understand is that at the epicenter of nonlinearity, okay, of this philosophy is the economy. And that's why we're making this video today. Because we are told the stock market is going up, unemployment rates are going down, but our national debt is growing, and medium income levels have remained stagnant since the mid 1970s, right? So, how does this managerial philosophy of shape-shifting and nonlinearity manifest itself practically in economic policies, right? Well, the answer to that question is through quantitative easing. We print money and pump trillions of dollars back into the economy through quantitative easing. We did this once in 2008 and 2009, and we saw it did not help the people it was supposed to. The data shows, like you can go look at this yourself, that about over 90% of that money went into the hands of the wealthiest 5% of global citizens, not just Americans. It was way less than Americans, probably less than 1% of Americans. Now, one could argue that that is the largest transfer of wealth to the rich in all of documented history. You can think about it as socialism for the rich. But then we decided to do it again in 2020 and 2021. We continued to print trillions of dollars. But what's so interesting about quantitative easing is that very few people in the digital landscape anywhere really has studied the origins of quantitative easing. Who came up with these mathematical models, the economic theories that underpin quantitative easing? Now, in one of my books that I own, it describes these origins, and it sums it up really nicely in this chapter. And it basically outlines this conversation between President Gorbachev, Mikhail Gorbachev, and this Russian economist. So he says, Mr. President, when Homer returns to write the history of our epic, he will say that the Russian mathematicians swept out of Muscovy in 1991 and presented themselves before the gates of Wall Street bearing the gift of quantitative risk management models, quantitative easing. They were received with joy and set to work, and in 20 years had destroyed the place entirely. It was he who will say, the greatest Trojan horse operation since Troy. So, this is the inventor of quantitative easing describing how the United States economy, utilizing their economic models of quantitative easing, is the greatest Trojan horse operation since Troy. Okay. So what does this all mean? What are we really talking about? You know? So I'll leave you with this. Christopher Nolan, this is a scene from Inception, is famous for portraying these ideas of undermined perception and perception manipulation in his films like Inception and Tenet, right? Because and the reason why these movies work is because it touches on the strange mood of our time, where nothing really makes any coherent sense. We live in this like constant circus of contradictory stories that makes it impossible for any real opposition to emerge. Because to emerge with its own coherent narrative. Because it is impossible to define what the opposition really is and what their goals really are. But that is by design. Their only goal is to maintain power through the simulation and stimulation of economic growth and democratic participation. And I would argue that is what the West is doing today. The West is engaged in this methodology of nonlinearity that underpins our political and economic policies. That's today's video. Hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you have a phenomenal Easter. Crisis King.